Hello everybody, from this video we will start to learn chapter 11, fiscal policy. And I'm sure many of you already heard this term before you start to learn this chapter. However, in this chapter we will go in depth to learn what is a fiscal policy and how will that help the economy. And before we start to look at the introduction of this chapter, and I want to remind you, whatever we learn from chapter 10 is very important because chapter 10 builds up the basic foundation and terminology for this chapter. If you already forgot what you've already learned from chapter 10, and I highly recommend to review it before you keep watching this video. And so in chapter 10, we will already look at what is the how the market will do the self-adjustment, and when sometimes the market doesn't work well, and they will achieve the instability. And we learn that if the market cannot perform self-adjustment well, and we need a government intervention. So what would be the possible intervention? So fiscal policy are talking about a couple of the method the government can use so that it can help to adjust the market so that the market can back to normal and to run by themselves. So here I want to emphasize that when you are learning this chapter, please try to think about the government like a doctor. So if you are being a doctor, so you need to know what kind of medication you can use to treat a certain disease, and also you need to know the dose. So you don't want to overdose it, or you don't want to give less doses. So that's why it's very important in this chapter. You're not only learning what will be the possible tool to consider as a fiscal policy, but also most importantly, you need to know how the size of the intervention, So this chapter we focus on the Keynesian solution to economic stability, fiscal policy. And from the Keynesian perspective, we understand that a too little aggregate demand will cause unemployment, but a too much aggregate demand causes inflation. So you have to have the right amount. Since the economy does not self-correct, so the federal government must step in to achieve stability. So what he tried to suggest is, the government can use fiscal policy. So for the fiscal policy, the definition is the use of the government taxes and the spending to alter macroeconomic outcomes. So now you understand when we talk about the fiscal policy, we only talk about two possible actions government will take. First is tax, second is spending. First is tax, second is spending. So it's nothing related to interest rate. It's nothing related to issuing more currency or reducing the currency. It's literally about the taxation and government spending. And so in this chapter, and we will examine some of the tools the federal government can use to alter macroeconomic outcomes. So the question to be kept in mind, or which is our learning objective, are following. First, can government spending and the tax policies ensure full employment? So remember, we have two macroeconomic goals. One is full employment. And two, what policy action will help fight inflation? And you remember, we have second our macroeconomic goal, which is stability. So fighting inflation is try to achieve the price stability. And three, what are the risks of the government intervention? So we suggest government can help the market that is unstable, but we have to be aware what is the weakness of the government intervention. So we will learn all of those during this chapter. And so remember, keep in mind, after you learn this chapter, you should check out the learning objectives and see how much you already got it. So the learning objective for this chapter including the followings: how and why the real GDP gap and aggregate demand shortfall differ. So which means if you try to close the real GDP gap and you are for the government intervention, You shouldn't only just shift an AD curve to only match the GDP, to close the GDP gap. Actually, sometimes you need to shift more, and we can explain the reason why later. And second learning objective, so the tools of the fiscal stimuli and their desired scope. And learning objective 3, what aggregate demand exceed measures. Number 4, the tools of the fiscal restraint and their desired scope. Number 5, how the multiplier affects the fiscal policy. As I said, we learned chapter 10 about multiplier, and we're going to see it again, and hopefully you understand what is the multiplier effect. So in next video, we will talk about why the taxation and the spending can be a good tool to be used to adjust the unstable market.